When I was growing up, I was told that family was the safest place in the world, that it would always be there to protect me, to shield me from harm. But that was a lie. The biggest lie I ever heard. Because it wasn't out in the world where I was hurt. It was inside my own home, within the walls of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by dolls on the shelf and crayon drawings I'd made on the walls. The truth is, my family was where my pain began. And for the longest time I believed it was my fault. That somehow I had caused the chaos, the hatred, and the violence. I believed that if I could just be quieter, just be better, maybe everything would be different. But now, at 73 years old, I know that none of it was my fault. I know that I didn't deserve what happened to me. My name is Eleanor Reeves, but when I was born in 1951, I was Jessica Randall. I was raised in a small town in rural Alabama, Oakage, a place where families were supposed to stay together no matter what. Where fathers were respected, where women were supposed to serve quietly, and children, especially girls, were expected to obey and be grateful for everything. It was a time when girls weren't allowed to speak up. We didn't have a voice, not in the eyes of our fathers or even our mothers. When something went wrong, it was always the girl's fault. When I was younger, I didn't know this. I didn't know that my brother Tony, who was 5 years older than me, wasn't supposed to be the one hurting me. He was my brother after all. He was supposed to protect me, to teach me things like how to climb trees and fish in the creek behind our house. But instead, I learned how to be scared of him. I learned how to hide when he entered the room. I remember the first time I felt something was wrong. I was about 7 years old, playing house in the yard. I heard my father shouting at my mother in the kitchen. It wasn't unusual for him to yell. He had a temper that flared easily, especially after a long day at the nuclear plant where he worked. But this time it felt different. "Martha, stop coddling that girl," he yelled. "Let her learn that in this house I'm in charge. Me and Tony." Tony. My older brother, Tony. Those words hit me like a slap. Me and Tony. Not me, not the girl, but him. Tony was the favorite. Tony was the one who could do no wrong. At the time, I didn't understand why my father treated Tony like a king, while I was invisible. As I grew older, though, I began to see it more clearly. I was the unwanted girl. I was the disappointment. The one who had been born when they were hoping for another boy. It didn't matter how hard I tried, how good I was, how quiet and obedient I became. To my father, I was just an afterthought. A mistake. But Tony? He could do no wrong. Tony was everything my father ever wanted. He looked like him, dark hair, tall, broad-shouldered, green eyes that seemed to come from nowhere. All of our family had brown eyes, so when people saw Tony's bright green eyes, they would say, "Look at that boy. He's going to break hearts someday." My father loved hearing that. He thought it meant Tony was destined for greatness. What no one knew was that the first heart Tony would destroy would be mine. He taught me to climb trees, to fish, to whistle. He was the older brother, the protector, at least that's what I thought at the time. But as I got older, things began to change. Slowly but steadily, Tony started showing a different side. A side that made me uncomfortable. A wandering hand here. Strange look there. First, I didn't know what to make of it. I thought maybe it was normal. After all, he was my brother, and brothers were supposed to love their sisters, right? But as the years passed, I began to realize that what Tony was doing wasn't normal. It was wrong. I remember one night when I was about 9 years old. It was Easter Sunday, and I was wearing the yellow dress Mama had sewn for me. I was feeling good, feeling like maybe, just maybe, this holiday would be different. We had a family gathering at the house, uncles, cousins, neighbors. There was a barbecue in the backyard, and everyone was complimenting how pretty I looked. But Tony, he didn't like it. I saw it in his eyes, the sudden shift from fondness to something else. Anger, maybe? Possessiveness for sure. "Think you're so pretty, huh?" Tony sneered, pulling me aside, away from the crowd. "You think they're all looking at you?" He gripped my arm too tightly. "You're mine, you hear me? Mine." His words didn't make sense. I was confused. A brother doesn't own a sister, I thought. But that's when I felt it, the cold, crawling fear that would follow me for years. The possessiveness in his voice. The sense that something was terribly wrong. I tried to tell Mama about it, but she didn't want to listen. She was washing dishes in the kitchen, her hands covered in suds. When I mentioned it to her, she looked at me briefly, with an expression I'll never forget, an expression of fear. "It's all in your head, honey. she whispered, turning back to her work. Your brother loves you. He just wants to protect you. Those words stayed with me, buried deep inside. He just wants to protect you. But I knew it wasn't protection. It was control. It was manipulation. It was a lie I had to live with every day. As I got older, things got worse. Tony started coming into my room at night. At first, it was just sitting on the edge of the bed. Then it was touching me. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew it was wrong. I tried to scream, but he would cover my mouth, threatening me. If you tell anyone, I'll say you were fooling around with Mike from the grocery store. And you know what Dad will do to you. I knew exactly what Dad would do. He'd believe Tony. He'd believe whatever Tony said because Tony could do no wrong. And I, the girl, was always the one at fault. Every night I prayed for it to stop. Every night I lay there pretending to sleep, hoping Tony would leave me alone. But it didn't stop. It got worse. At 11 years old, I was no longer the girl playing with dolls. I was trapped. Trapped in a house where the monster wore the face of my brother. Trapped in a world where no one believed me, where no one saw the truth. And as much as I tried to fight back, the truth was this. I was alone. This was my world, my reality. But it was also a lie. Because inside that house, I learned something that would stay with me forever. Family is not always the safest place in the world. Sometimes it's the place where your greatest fears come to life. And for me, it took years, decades in fact, to realize that the lie wasn't just in my home. The lie was in me. The lie that I was at fault. The lie that it was my fault that I couldn't make things better. It wasn't my fault. And I didn't deserve any of it. It wasn't until I left that house, escaped to a new life, that I finally understood. I didn't need anyone's permission to live. I was my own person. And I was stronger than I'd ever known. Growing up in Oak Ridge, Alabama, our house was a perfect reflection of what society expected. A typical Southern family. On the outside, everything seemed as it should be, neat, proper, and full of the charm you'd expect in a small town where everyone knew each other's business. We lived in a modest but comfortable 3-room house. The kind of house that had a faded American flag hanging in the front porch and a white picket fence, though it had seen better days. It was the kind of place where the grass was always mowed neatly, and the house always smelled of cornbread and fried chicken, simple but warm. My father, John Randall, was the kind of man who demanded respect. In Oak Ridge, if your last name was Randall, people expected you to be successful, hardworking, and upstanding. John worked at the local nuclear plant. What exactly he did there I wasn't ever sure, but he brought home a paycheck every week and that was enough. When he walked into a room, you knew it. His presence was commanding, his gruff voice carried through the air, and his broad shoulders made him seem untouchable. To the outside world, my father was a good man, a hard-working man, a man who loved his family. But behind closed doors, things were different. My mother, Martha Randall, was the perfect Southern wife. Quiet, reserved, and dedicated to keeping the house running smoothly. She worked hard, sometimes sewing clothes for the neighbors to make extra money, sometimes taking in laundry, but mostly staying home, cooking, cleaning, and caring for my brother Tony and me. I remember her hands, always busy, always worn. She had a way of making everything feel safe, even though I knew she wasn't always happy. But in our house, happiness was a luxury for another time. Martha always tried to protect me. I know she did. She would whisper to me when my father was in one of his moods, telling me to stay quiet and let it pass. She'd remind me that everything would be okay eventually. But it wasn't okay. As a child, I didn't understand the intricacies of relationships, especially not those between my mother and father. I didn't understand why she let him yell at her. I didn't understand why, even when he raised his hand to hit her, she didn't fight back. I never understood why, when he'd come home drunk, she'd just stay silent and take it, as if she had no voice, no choice. Maybe it was the way she was raised, taught to be obedient, to never speak up. But it hurt me and I felt helpless, unable to do anything. But even then, I didn't know what it meant to be truly trapped. At least, not until I realized what was happening in the dark corners of our home. The things my brother Tony was doing to me. Tony was 5 years older than me, and at first, he was like any older brother, teasing, protective, and somewhat distant. He taught me how to climb trees, how to fish in the creek behind our house, and even how to whistle. He was the golden boy, my father's pride and joy. He had the looks, the charm, and the charisma that made people like him. The neighbors always said he was too handsome for his own good. They said he would break hearts when he was older. What they didn't know was that the first heart Tony would break would be mine. When I was 7, I noticed that something about Tony had changed. It started slowly, just little things. He would hug me too tight, make strange excuses to be near me, and sometimes he would look at me in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't understand it at first. He was my brother after all. And brothers, I thought, were supposed to love their sisters. But as the days went by, I began to notice more, and understand less. His touches became less innocent, more possessive. He'd corner me in the room, whisper things in my ear that didn't make sense, and every time I tried to push him away, he'd find a way to make me feel guilty. It was hard to speak up. Harder still when my father was so blind to it all, so proud of his perfect son. If I had said anything, I knew what would happen. I'd be called a liar, a troublemaker. My father would punish me for making up stories about his golden boy. I was the one who was wrong. I was the one who had to be quiet, who had to take the blame. But even at such a young age, I started to realize that what Tony was doing wasn't just brotherly love. It was something far darker. Something I couldn't name at first but could feel deep in my gut. I remember the first time I tried to tell my mother about it. I was 9 and it was Easter Sunday. We had a family gathering, cousins, uncles, aunts. Everyone gathered in our small backyard for a barbecue. I was dressed in the yellow dress my mother had sewn for me, and everyone was complimenting me, telling me how pretty I looked. For a brief moment I thought that maybe I could be normal like other kids, enjoying Easter with my family, laughing, playing. But Tony didn't like that. I saw the anger in his eyes, the tight grip he had on his soda cup, and the way his knuckles turned white. When everyone went to the backyard for the barbecue, he pulled me aside. "Think you're so pretty, huh?" he sneered, his voice low and dangerous. "Trying to get attention?" Confused, I asked, "What do you mean?" He pulled me close, his voice colder. "You're mine, you hear me? Mine. And if I catch you trying to get attention from anyone else, I'll make sure they know you're mine." I didn't understand what he meant. Brothers weren't supposed to own their sisters. But as the days passed, I began to understand what Tony meant, and it terrified me. When I tried to tell my mother, she dismissed it. "It's just in your head, honey. Tony loves you. He just wants to protect you." But I knew. I knew it wasn't protection. It was control. It was manipulation. And no one, not even my mother, was willing to see it. By the time I was 11, the situation had spiraled out of control. Tony's visits to my room at night became a routine, always when everyone else was asleep. Sometimes he wouldn't even wait for the cover of night. He'd come into the bathroom when I was showering, standing just outside the door watching me. He'd make excuses. "I just need to use the bathroom." I knew better. By then I had learned to keep quiet. My silence was my survival. I would pretend to sleep, squeeze my eyes shut, and pray that he would go away. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. One night on my 11th birthday, everything changed. My mother had made me a simple birthday cake, cornbread with strawberry jam. My father didn't celebrate birthdays, but Mama always made sure I had something, even if it was small. Tony, however, had a different idea for my birthday. He came into my room, sat on the edge of my bed and hugged me. But this time the hug lasted too long. It was too tight. His hand slid down my back, stopping where it shouldn't have. I froze, terrified. When I pulled away, I looked at my mother for help. She saw it. She saw the discomfort in my eyes. But instead of intervening, she looked away. She said nothing. And in that moment I understood. My mother knew. She knew what was happening, but she was too afraid to stop it. Too afraid to lose my father's approval. Too afraid to break the illusion of the perfect family. From that moment on, everything changed. I wasn't just a girl anymore. I wasn't just Jessica Randall, the daughter who couldn't do anything right. I was Tony's possession, his secret. And the worst part? I had nowhere to turn. I was trapped. As I grew older, the changes in my brother Tony became more apparent. What had started as small, seemingly innocent gestures, the lingering hugs, the unexplained touches, soon morphed into something far darker. I was just a child, barely able to understand the full weight of what was happening, but I knew enough to recognize that something was deeply wrong. Tony and I shared a room, a cramped space at the back of the house, the kind that parents usually reserved for the children who were the least favored. First, it wasn't bad. He taught me how to fish, how to climb trees, how to whistle like the men in the neighborhood did when they thought no one was looking. He was the big brother I looked up to, the protector in my eyes. But that protection quickly turned into something suffocating. He began staying in my bed late at night, even though he had his own. First, I didn't understand why. I thought maybe he was just afraid of the dark, maybe he missed being a little boy, and I was too young to question it. He'd make up excuses. He was cold, or the thunder scared him, or he missed when he was younger, when we'd both sleep in the same bed. My mother would scold him, telling him to go to his own bed. But the next night he would be back. He always had an excuse. My father never saw anything wrong with it. In fact, he thought it was good that we were so close. "Look at those two," he'd say with pride. "That's a real family. Close-knit. That's the way it should be." But what my father didn't realize, what no one saw, was that this closeness, this so-called bond, was built on manipulation. My brother, my protector, was becoming the source of my fear. I had no voice. My father wouldn't believe me. And my mother? She was too afraid to do anything about it. Her silence spoke louder than any words ever could. She feared my father's anger more than anything, and I soon realized that I too would have to live in fear. The first time I tried to speak up, I was about 9 years old. It was Easter Sunday, and the whole family was gathered at our house. I wore a yellow dress that my mother had sewn with love, and I felt a sense of pride that day. The house was full of laughter, compliments, and chatter. But Tony, he didn't like it. I saw it in his eyes when everyone was complimenting me on how I had grown, how pretty I looked. The admiration I was receiving made him angry. He pulled me aside when no one was looking and said, "You think you're so pretty, huh?" Trying to get attention from everyone. I was confused. "What do you mean? I'm just here eating cake with everyone." He stepped closer, his voice lowering dangerously. "You're mine. You hear me? Mine. And if I catch you talking to anyone else like that again, I'll make sure you regret it." I didn't understand. How could he say that? He was my brother. Brothers didn't own sisters. But even as I tried to push the thought away, I felt the chill of fear settle deep in my bones. I was only 9, but in that moment I realized that I was no longer just his sister. I was a possession, something he thought he could control. Later that night I went to my mother. I couldn't bear to carry the weight of what was happening any longer. I told her hesitantly what Tony had said to me. I hoped she would see it for what it was, a brother trying to control his younger sister. But she didn't see it. She didn't want to see it. Her hands were deep in the suds, scrubbing the dishes, and she paused only briefly to glance at me. "It's all in your head, honey," she said, trying to reassure me, her voice soft and tired. "Tony loves you. He just wants to protect you." Protect me? I didn't feel protected. I felt trapped. But I didn't have the words to argue with her. So I stayed silent. I stayed quiet and carried on pretending that everything was fine. I learned quickly that speaking up didn't help. No one listened. No one cared. And the more I tried to scream, the more they dismissed me. I was just the girl who made things up. The girl who cried too much. The girl who needed to learn to be quiet to stop stirring the pot. As the years passed, Tony's behavior became more brazen, more overt. He started coming into my room at night. First it was just to talk. Then it was to touch me. His hands would wander over my body, and I would freeze in place pretending to be asleep. I couldn't move, couldn't cry out. I felt trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. And every time after he'd leave, he'd tell me the same thing. "Don't tell anyone. If you do, I'll tell Dad that you're lying. He'll never believe you." I couldn't take that chance. My father had always thought the world of Tony. In his eyes, Tony could do no wrong. If I told, I would be the one who was punished. I would be the one who was labeled the liar, the troublemaker. And so I stayed silent. Every night became a new battle. I would lie in bed, my eyes squeezed shut, pretending to sleep, hoping that somehow, some way he would leave me alone. I prayed for it to stop. I prayed for the strength to fight back. But every time I failed. But despite the fear, despite the pain, something inside me was changing. I was no longer that little girl who believed that family was safe. I was no longer that child who thought everything would get better if I stayed quiet. I started to hate the house, hate the room I shared with Tony, Hate the feeling of being trapped under the same roof as the monster who was supposed to protect me, but instead was the one who destroyed my trust, my innocence, and my sense of safety. But no one knew. No one saw. No one cared. One day, I tried to speak to Mrs. Johnson, the neighbor who was always kind to me. She had been one of the few women who spoke to me with compassion, not dismissing my fears or treating me like I was making things up. But when I tried to tell her, to say the words that had been choking me for so long, I couldn't do it. The words wouldn't come out. She knew. I could see it in her eyes. But like everyone else, she did nothing. She said nothing. She simply gave me a sad smile and turned away. I didn't know what to do. I was completely alone. My mother was too afraid to help, my father was too blind to see, and Tony? Well, he was too powerful. I was trapped in a house that should have been a safe haven but instead was my prison. And that was when I decided that I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to leave. I had to get away from Tony, from the constant fear, from the silence that had filled our home. But how? How could a young girl escape from a house where every door seemed locked, every window barred by fear and shame? That was the moment I started planning my escape. My father, John Randall, always made sure that everyone knew who he was. He had that kind of presence, loud, gruff, and unyielding. In Oakage, a man like him was someone you respected, feared, and never crossed. He worked hard at the nuclear plant, though no one ever really knew the details of what he did there. All I knew was that he came home every night smelling of whiskey and cigarettes, sometimes in a good mood, sometimes in a terrible one. When he was in a good mood, he'd pretend like I didn't exist. He'd walk into the house, his boots thudding against the wooden floor, and call out for Tony, my older brother. "Hey Tony, how's my boy today? You ready to go hunting this weekend?" He'd ask, his voice booming. He'd ruffle Tony's hair and laugh with him, always with a smile on his face. To my father, Tony was everything, strong, capable, and most importantly, a boy. My father didn't know what to do with a girl like me. I wasn't what he wanted, what he had hoped for. Growing up, I learned to live in my father's shadow. In the shadow of a boy who could do no wrong. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how quiet or obedient I was never good enough for him. I was the constant reminder of a mistake, a burden, something he didn't want. But Tony could do no wrong. Even when he was a little boy, Tony was treated like royalty in our home. He was tall for his age, dark-haired with piercing green eyes that no one in the family could explain. He looked nothing like our father, whose features were rough and weathered, but no one ever seemed to care. Tony was a reflection of something better in my father's eyes. A son who would carry on the family name. A son who would be everything I could never be. I remember how my father's pride swelled when Tony excelled in sports. Every weekend, he would drag me along to watch Tony play baseball, sitting in the stands with a beer in his hand, bragging to anyone who would listen. "That's my boy out there, the one who's going to take over my business one day. He's a natural," he'd say, clapping Tony on the back. My heart would sink each time. I couldn't help but feel like I didn't belong in that world, that I would never measure up to the son my father had always wanted. But it wasn't just the public pride that crushed me. It was the way my father treated me in private. I could never do enough to earn his approval. My every action seemed to disappoint him. When I tried to play sports, he'd dismiss me with a wave of his hand saying, "That's for boys, not girls. Go help your mother in the kitchen." And the worst part? I wasn't just invisible to him. I was a burden. Problem. My father made it clear every chance he got that he didn't want me around. The number of times he would call me a mistake or a disappointment still echoes in my mind. "I wanted another boy," he would say to his friends. "But what do I get? A girl. A girl who can't even take care of herself." I remember sitting in the living room, listening to my father and Tony talk, watching my father's face light up as he spoke about Tony's future. "That boy's going to be a success. He's got the looks, the brains, the strength. You mark my words, he's going to be the best of us all." And I would sit there in silence, feeling my heart break a little more each time. I wasn't allowed to be part of that dream. I wasn't allowed to be part of his future. But it wasn't just the neglect that hurt. It was the subtle cruelty. The way my father's treatment of me made me feel small and insignificant. The way he would always choose Tony over me. I remember when I was around 10, my father took Tony on a fishing trip. It was just the two of them and I wasn't invited. My father didn't even say goodbye to me. Tony was the one he cared about. Tony was the one who mattered. I remember feeling a deep pang of longing as I watched them leave, the truck's engine revving as they drove off into the distance. I stayed behind with my mother, who was always too tired to say much. But even in the silence I knew she felt it too. She felt the weight of being a woman in a house that didn't value her, that didn't value me. My mother, Martha, was a saint in her own right. She was small, delicate, with a kind face that had been worn down by years of hard work. Her hands were always rough from scrubbing, sewing, and taking in laundry from the neighbors. She never complained, never raised her voice, but I could see the weariness in her eyes. I could see the toll it had taken on her. She tried to protect me. I know she did. But she was weak, too afraid of my father to stop him. When I was younger, I would try to talk to her. I would tell her that Tony was acting strange, that he was doing things that made me uncomfortable. But she would always look at me as if she knew but couldn't say anything. She would whisper, "It's just in your head, sweetheart. Tony loves you. He's just looking out for you." And I would nod, even though deep down I knew she was lying to me. It wasn't just her, though. It was everyone. I couldn't tell anyone what was happening. If I did, they would have thought I was crazy. They would have thought I was just a silly girl making things up. Tony was too popular, too charming. He had everyone fooled. No one would believe me. By the time I was 12, the abuse had escalated. It wasn't just the odd touches or the lingering hugs anymore. It was more, much more. He started coming into my room at night late when everyone else was asleep. I would pretend to be asleep, squeeze my eyes shut, praying he would leave me alone. But he never did. It was the most confusing thing in the world. Tony was my brother. He was supposed to be my protector, my companion. But instead he had become my nightmare. And what made it even worse was the fact that my father who was supposed to protect me, was the one enabling him. Every time I tried to speak up, every time I tried to tell my mother or even a neighbor, I was shut down. It was always the same thing. "You're making it up. Stop causing trouble. Your brother is just showing you love." But love wasn't supposed to feel like this. Love wasn't supposed to hurt. It wasn't until I was 14 that the full extent of what Tony had been doing to me became clear. It was my birthday, my 14th birthday. My father had bought me an old doll he'd found somewhere. It was a cheap plastic thing, but he was proud of it, as if it was the best gift he could have given me. Tony gave me a plastic necklace, cheap and tacky, just like everything else in my life. That night, Tony came into my room again. But this time it was different. He didn't just sit on the edge of the bed. He didn't just touch me. He took everything from me that night. My innocence. My trust. My sense of self. And when it was over, he just left. Like it was nothing. The worst part? The worst part was that my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, the man who was supposed to love me, stood by and did nothing. He didn't even believe me. When I tried to tell him what Tony had done, he looked at me with disgust. "You're making things up again, girl. Stop lying about your brother. Tony would never hurt you." And in that moment I realized the truth. I was nothing to him. I was just a burden, a mistake, something to be swept under the rug and forgotten. I felt empty, hollow, as though the last shred of hope had been ripped away from me. But that night, in the silence of my room, I made a vow to myself. I would never let this happen again. I would find a way to escape. I would break free from this nightmare. And I would never let Tony win. That night, I finally understood the true meaning of fear. Not the fear that comes from being yelled at, not the fear of breaking something by accident, but the kind of terror that completely consumes you. It was the night that everything shifted. The night that my life would never be the same again. I was only 14, but it felt like I had lived a lifetime of pain. The night started like any other. It was my birthday and I had hoped that maybe, just for once, things would be different. Maybe I could have a moment of peace, a break from the chaos that consumed our home. But I quickly realized that peace was never meant for me. I was sitting in my room, quietly holding a cheap doll my father had given me for my birthday. It was one of those toys you'd find at a discount store, nothing special. But for some reason my father was so proud of it. He thought that doll was the best gift he could have gotten me. In his eyes it was a symbol of his love. But I knew better. I knew that doll was nothing more than a token. Something he gave me because he had no real understanding of what love meant. Tony, my brother, came into my room that night just like he had countless times before. But tonight was different. Tonight, the air felt thick with something I couldn't quite understand, something darker. He walked in without knocking as usual, and locked the door behind him. I barely had time to react before he sat down beside me on the bed. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, staring at me with those piercing green eyes that had always made me uneasy. I tried to move away, but he was too close. My heart was racing in my chest as he leaned in, his breath smelling of whiskey, and whispered in my ear, "You're getting older now, Jessica. It's time to stop pretending." I didn't understand what he meant. I couldn't comprehend the terror that was about to unfold. But then before I could stop him, Tony pulled me toward him. The moment his hands touched my body, I froze. His grip was tight and unrelenting, and I couldn't move. I wanted to scream to push him away, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to comprehend what was happening. I could feel his hot breath on my neck as he whispered, "You're mine, Jessica. You've always been mine." The words made no sense. Brothers weren't supposed to say things like that to their sisters. Brothers weren't supposed to touch their sisters like this. But somehow, Tony had convinced himself that he owned me, that I was just another possession. Something he could take, something he could control. The next few minutes were a blur. I don't even remember how it all happened. All I knew was that it hurt. More than I could ever have imagined. It wasn't just the physical pain, though that was enough. It was the emotional and mental anguish, the betrayal, the realization that the person who was supposed to protect me, the person I had always trusted, had just stolen something from me that could never be returned. When it was over, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't move. I felt like I was sinking into the bed, like I was disappearing. I didn't know what to say, what to think. My mind was in chaos, my body numb. But Tony didn't seem to care. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer any words of comfort. Instead, he just stood up, straightened his clothes, and said, "You're lucky. You should be grateful. Now you know what it means to be a woman." His voice was cold, dismissive. And with that, he left. Just like that. He walked out of my room, leaving me behind in a whirlwind of confusion, pain, and horror. I lay there for hours, unable to cry, unable to scream. It was as if the world had stopped turning. The only sound I could hear was the beating of my own heart, echoing in my ears. I wanted to go to my mother. I wanted to tell her what had happened, to scream for help. But I knew I couldn't. I knew she wouldn't believe me. What good would it do to tell her? Tony was her pride. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. If I told her, she would blame me. She would say I was making things up. And if I told my father, well, I already knew what would happen. He would believe Tony. He always did. And I would be the one to suffer. That was the night I learned the cruelest truth of all. I was alone. There was no one in that house who would help me. No one who would listen. No one who would protect me. The next morning, I woke up to the same routine. My father was still gone, working at the plant. My mother was still doing the laundry, still putting on the mask of the perfect wife. And Tony? He acted like nothing had happened, like nothing had changed. I, on the other hand, felt like I had died inside. A part of me was gone, stolen, never to return. I knew from that moment on that I had to get out. I had to escape. But how? How could a 14-year-old girl escape from a house where every door was locked, where every window was barred by the weight of fear and shame? That was when I began to plan. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to get away. I had to save myself. And, more importantly, I had to save my future. Because I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't let Tony keep taking from me. I couldn't let him destroy me. I spent the next few weeks in silence, pretending everything was normal. But inside I was falling apart. The girl who once dreamed of having a family, of growing up in a safe home, was now a prisoner in her own house. But I was determined. I would find a way out, no matter what it took. And one day when the time was right, I would run. I would leave that house and I would never look back. The reality of my situation began to sink in slowly, like a dark cloud that stretched further and further, until it enveloped everything. I was 14 years old and I was pregnant. My body, my small, still developing body, was carrying a child that had been conceived in a nightmare. A child that was part of me, yes, but also part of him. The very man who had stolen my innocence and crushed every piece of hope I'd ever had. I remember the moment I realized something was wrong. It wasn't obvious at first. I had been feeling nauseous for days, but I thought it was just the stress of everything that had been happening in our house. I thought I was just tired, that maybe I hadn't been eating properly, or perhaps it was just a bad case of nerves. But when my period didn't come, when it was weeks late, I knew. I just knew. The panic set in immediately. I couldn't let anyone find out. My father was already violent enough. If he knew about this, if Tony knew, there was no telling what would happen. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't bring shame to the family. The fear I had lived with for years now had a new face. This time it was my future. My life as I knew it was about to end. I couldn't even bring myself to say the words out loud. I thought I might die from the weight of it, the shame of carrying a child who wasn't supposed to be here. I started researching in secret, trying to figure out what I could do. But every option seemed to be a dead end. My mother would never help me. She could barely keep herself afloat, let alone me. And Tony? He was the reason this was happening. I kept praying for a miracle, hoping that somehow the situation would resolve itself. Maybe it wasn't true, maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down I knew the truth. And the truth was that I was pregnant, and I had no way of undoing it. The hardest part was when I had to hide it. I tried wearing loose clothes, trying to cover my growing belly, but it became harder and harder as the weeks passed. I couldn't hide it from my mother for long. I would catch her looking at me with that strange, almost pitying look. She knew. She had to. But she didn't say anything. She never asked me if I was okay, never questioned the signs she must have noticed. The change in my body, the way I withdrew even more, the tears I tried to hide. One night when I was lying in bed, feeling the baby stir inside of me, I finally broke. I started crying not just because of what had happened, but because of the future I saw ahead of me. The future where I was forced to stay silent, where I would never be allowed to leave this prison. I couldn't bear to tell anyone. What would I say? How could I explain that my own brother had done this to me? And what would happen to the baby? Could I ever look at him without seeing the face of my tormentor? But then one day, after what felt like an eternity of hiding and pretending, my mother found out. She must have noticed the changes in my body, how my stomach was growing, how my clothes no longer fit properly. One morning as I was washing my face, I saw her standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with concern, but also with something else, fear. Fear for me, fear for herself, and maybe even fear for Tony. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there watching me, and for a moment I thought she might walk away. But then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Jessica, are you pregnant?" I froze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't answer. The words were trapped in my throat. How could I tell her? How could I admit what had happened when I knew she was just as scared as I was? I knew she was already living in fear of my father, and now I was going to be the one to drag her deeper into this nightmare. But she wouldn't leave me alone. She walked closer, took my hands in hers, and repeated, "Jessica, are you pregnant?" Finally I nodded. It wasn't much, just a tiny movement of my head, but it was enough. The look on her face, a mix of horror and pity, told me everything I needed to know. She knew. She had always known. Her hands shook as she took a step back, and I could see that she didn't know what to do. "How did this happen?" she asked, her voice trembling. I wanted to scream, to tell her everything, to make her see the truth. But I couldn't. Instead I whispered, "It's Tony. It's Tony who did this to me." Her face went pale, and she staggered back as though I had slapped her. She sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at me as though I were a stranger. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the disbelief, and then beneath all of that, a deep, deep sadness. She had always known there was something wrong with Tony, but I don't think she had ever imagined this. She had seen the signs, but she had always convinced herself it wasn't true. How could it be? For a long time she didn't say anything. She just sat there, her hands wringing together in her lap. I watched her, waiting for some kind of answer, some kind of relief. But there was nothing. No help. No understanding. Just silence. Finally, after what felt like hours, she spoke, but her words were soft, barely audible. "What do you want me to do, Jessica? What can we do?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. I couldn't go back to the way things were, and I couldn't keep living this lie. I didn't want to bring another child into this mess. Into a world where I had no control. Where the person who was supposed to protect me had become my worst enemy. I don't know, Mama. I whispered, my voice breaking. I just don't know. She nodded slowly, her face full of regret.
I'm sorry, Jessica.
I'm so sorry. I should have done something sooner. But there was nothing to be done now. The damage had been done. And now I had to face the consequences of the choices I hadn't made. As I looked at my mother, I realized just how much she had failed me. Not because she hadn't tried, but because she had been too afraid to act. She had been trapped in her own prison, and now we both were. The days that followed were a blur of fear and shame. I couldn't leave the house, couldn't go anywhere without feeling the weight of my secret pressing down on me. I couldn't even look at my own reflection in the mirror without feeling disgusted. And every time I saw Tony, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. He was still the golden boy in my father's eyes, still the one everyone adored. And I was just the girl who had caused the family disgrace. But as my body grew, so did my resolve. I couldn't stay in that house forever. I couldn't let my child grow up in the same place I had. I had to find a way out. I had to escape. I had to give my son a future, even if it meant leaving everything behind. And so I began to plan. I began to figure out how I could get away from Oakage, away from the house, and away from Tony. The idea of escaping had consumed me. Every waking hour I thought about it. My mind raced with possibilities but also with fears. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed help. More than that, I needed a plan. But the plan had to be perfect. The slightest mistake, the smallest slip-up, and it would be over. My father's temper was unpredictable. He could lash out in an instant, and I had learned that there was no room for error. I had to act quickly, before Tony noticed any changes. Before anyone figured out that I was planning to leave. I couldn't risk it. It was now or never. The first step was to gather what I could, anything I could carry. I found an old suitcase that I had once used for school trips. It was worn and faded, but it was the only thing I had that could hold enough of my things to survive for a while. I packed only the essentials. Clothes for Charles, a few of my own things, and a little bit of money I had been hiding. I had been saving it in secret, hiding it away in an old shoebox under my bed. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get me started. But there was one problem: how to leave without anyone noticing. Our house was small. The rooms were close together. There was no real way to slip out unnoticed. My father was always either in the living room drinking and watching TV, or in the yard working on something. But he was always home. He never left. And Tony? He was around too, always watching me, always lurking. As if he had nothing better to do but make sure I didn't escape. The night I decided to leave, I knew it had to be after they had both gone to sleep. But the fear of being caught was overwhelming. The thought of Tony coming into my room again, the thought of my father waking up and stopping me, it was enough to make me freeze in place. But I couldn't freeze. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. So I gathered all the courage I could muster and made my move. I waited until the dead of night, when everything was still and quiet. I held Charles close to me as I slipped out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I felt like a thief in the night, sneaking out of my own home. But I wasn't stealing anything. I was taking back what had been taken from me for so long, my freedom. I tiptoed to the front door, praying that it wouldn't creak. I had learned over the years how to open the door without making a sound, how to move without disturbing the stillness of the house. But just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it, a loud noise from the hallway. My heart stopped. I turned slowly, expecting to see Tony standing there, watching me with that sick smile he always wore when he caught me doing something he didn't like. But it wasn't Tony. It was my father. I froze. I stood there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do. My father's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of me holding the suitcase and Charles in my arms. His face twisted with confusion, then anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice low but filled with menace. "Where do you think you're going?" I didn't know how to respond. The words were stuck in my throat. I had rehearsed everything I would say, but now that the moment had come, I couldn't speak. I could only stand there trembling as my father took a step closer to me. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice growing louder. "Get back to bed." No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. What did you say? He barked. Get back to bed now. Before I could react, he lunged forward and grabbed me by the arm. His grip was tight, painful. I tried to pull away, but his fingers dug into my skin like steel. I'll teach you to leave me, he growled. I'll teach you to disobey. My heart pounded in my chest as he dragged me back toward the bedroom. The suitcase fell to the floor with a loud thud, and I heard Charles cry out from the sudden movement. Please, I begged, my voice shaking. I just want to leave. I just want to get away. But my father didn't care. He never cared. His rage only grew as he pulled me into the bedroom, and for the first time in my life, I saw something terrifying in his eyes. It wasn't just anger, it was malice. You think you're better than me? He spat, throwing me onto the bed. You think you can just walk away from this family? From me. Before I could say anything else, he hit me. The first blow landed across my cheek, sending a sharp pain through my face. I could feel the warmth of blood trickling from my lip, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for the next blow. You're not going anywhere, he repeated, each word punctuated with another slap. You're mine, Jessica. You'll always be mine. It was the first time I felt completely powerless. I had tried to escape. I had tried to run. But now it felt like the walls of the house were closing in on me, trapping me in a cage that I couldn't break free from. I cried not for myself but for Charles. I cried for the life I couldn't give him, the life he deserved, one free of fear, of violence, of pain. I knew that if I didn't get out soon, I would lose him too. But I wasn't going to give up. I couldn't. The next few days were the hardest. My father didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me. He went about his usual routine, ignoring me completely. It was as if I had disappeared from his world. Tony, however, was a different story. He watched me closely, his eyes never leaving me. He knew what I had tried to do. He knew I had tried to escape. And in some sick way, I think he enjoyed it. Every night he came into my room again. And every night I prayed for it to stop. I prayed for a way out. But the truth was, I couldn't do it alone. That's when I made the decision. If I was going to get out, I would need help. I couldn't escape alone, not anymore. I needed someone who could help me make it to the other side. Someone who could give me the strength I didn't have. I had to tell someone. And the only person I trusted was Mrs. Johnson, the neighbor. She had always been kind to me, always looked out for me, even when no one else did. The next day I went to her house. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. But I knew it was the only way. Mrs. Johnson, I said, my voice shaking. I need your help. I can't stay here anymore. I can't live like this. And in that moment I realized help was possible. There was a way out. It wasn't easy. It wasn't going to be simple. But it was possible. That was the first step. And it would be the last step I would ever take in Oakage. I had spent so many years in silence, too terrified to speak out, that when I finally decided to seek help, it almost felt like a betrayal. To whom? To the man who had hurt me? To the family who would never understand? No, it wasn't a betrayal. It was my survival. It was the first step I had taken to break free from the prison that had been built for me, and it was terrifying. The day I walked into Mrs. Johnson's house felt like stepping into another world. It wasn't the house I had grown up in, the cramped, suffocating walls that always seemed to close in on me. It was a small house, modest but warm. It smelled of lavender and fresh-baked bread, a stark contrast to the stale, smoky air of my father's house. The first thing I noticed was the calmness of it. Mrs. Johnson's house was filled with a peacefulness that I hadn't experienced in years. It was quiet, comfortable, and most importantly, safe. I stood at the door, unsure of what to say. My heart was racing, my palms sweaty. I had never spoken to anyone about what Tony had done to me. Not even my mother knew the extent of the abuse. She knew something was wrong, but she never asked. She was too scared to confront it, too scared to challenge the very foundation of the family she had built. But Mrs. Johnson, she wasn't afraid. She looked at me with a kindness that I had never seen before in anyone. She didn't judge me. She didn't ask why I hadn't spoken sooner. She just looked at me with understanding, as though she had known all along that something was wrong. She had seen the signs, even if I hadn't been able to name them. "Jessica dear, come in," she said softly, opening the door wider for me. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." I nodded, my throat tight. I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know if I could even say the words out loud. How could I explain to her what had been happening in my own home? How could I tell her about my brother? How could I speak the truth without feeling like I was betraying the family, even though I knew it wasn't my fault? I don't know how to start," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I felt like I was going to crumble under the weight of the truth. She guided me to a chair, sat down beside me, and simply waited. Her presence was so calming, so steady, that I felt like I could finally breathe. No one had ever given me space to just be before. My father had always demanded things from me, and my mother had always been too afraid to ask what I needed. But Mrs. Johnson was different. She didn't rush me. She didn't push me. She just let me sit in the silence, letting me gather the strength I needed to speak. After what felt like an eternity, I finally spoke. "It's my brother. I trailed off, not knowing how to say it. The shame was overwhelming. Mrs. Johnson didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just placed her hand on mine and whispered, "You're safe now, Jessica. You can say whatever you need to. No one is going to hurt you here." And that was when the floodgates opened. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, a blur of pain and fear that I had been holding in for years. I told her everything, about the touches, about the nights when Tony would come into my room, about how my father always sided with him, about how my mother turned a blind eye. I didn't hold anything back. I had to tell someone. I had to let someone know what had been happening to me. I couldn't keep it inside anymore. Mrs. Johnson listened without interrupting, her eyes full of compassion. She didn't make excuses for my family. She didn't say, "Well, maybe your father didn't know." She didn't tell me that it would be okay if I just ignored it. She understood. She knew how bad it was. She knew that my silence had been a prison, and she wasn't going to let me suffer in that silence any longer. "Jessica," she said when I finished, her voice calm but firm, "you are not alone. I believe you, and I'm going to help you. I can't imagine the pain you've been through, but I know that you deserve to live a life free of fear. You deserve to be safe." Her words were like a balm to my soul. For the first time in years, I felt like someone cared. Someone saw me. Someone knew what I had been through, and wasn't going to let it continue. Mrs. Johnson wasn't just offering me sympathy. She was offering me a way out. She was offering me hope. "I don't know how to leave," I confessed, my voice trembling. "I don't have anywhere to go. I don't have money. I don't know what to do." Mrs. Johnson didn't hesitate. She had a plan. She had resources I didn't even know existed. "There are shelters, Jessica," she said. "Places where you can go to get away. And I can help you get there. But you need to trust me. You need to let me help you." For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to trust someone. I allowed myself to believe that there was a way out. I had spent so many years believing that I was trapped, that there was no way to escape the nightmare of my family. But Mrs. Johnson gave me something I had never had before. A choice. She gave me a way to take control of my life again. Over the next few days, she worked behind the scenes to arrange for me to leave. She helped me pack a bag, told me where to go, and made sure I had the necessary documents to start a new life. She even arranged for a friend of hers, a woman named Martha, to take me in until I could get on my feet. Mrs. Johnson didn't just offer me a lifeline. She offered me a chance to start over, to live a life free from the horrors of my past. But even as I prepared to leave, I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I knew that once I left, there would be no turning back. I couldn't ever return to that house, to that family. I would be breaking ties with everything I had ever known. Yet, the thought of staying was even worse. The thought of living the rest of my life trapped in that house, under Tony's control, under my father's ignorance, was more than I could bear. The hardest part was saying goodbye to my mother. I knew she wouldn't understand. She would never support me leaving, not if it meant she had to face my father's wrath. But I couldn't live in that suffocating silence anymore. I couldn't be the daughter who was too afraid to speak up, too afraid to leave. The night I left, I slipped out of the house quietly, with nothing but the clothes on my back and the hope that things would be different. I left behind the only life I had ever known, the only family I had ever had. But I knew that if I didn't leave now, I would never have the chance again. Mrs. Johnson's quiet whispers of encouragement were the last thing I heard before I stepped into the unknown. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I had a feeling, just a small spark, that it would be worth it. For the first time in my life, I was free. The night I decided to leave felt like the most surreal moment of my life. There's a kind of stillness that settles in the hours before you make a decision that will change everything. You know it's coming, you feel the weight of it pressing down on your chest, but it's almost as if time slows down, holding its breath, waiting for you to make the choice. My heart was pounding and I could feel the weight of my own fear. But I also felt something else, determination. This was it. This was my chance. I had spent years dreaming of this moment, of the day I would leave Oakage, of the day I would leave behind everything that had bound me to a life of pain, of secrets and of silence. And now the moment had finally come. I had to do it. I had to leave. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew that leaving was my only option. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I couldn't live under Tony's gaze, under my father's indifference. I couldn't live in the shadows of my own fear. It wasn't just for me anymore, it was for Charles. My son. The little boy who didn't deserve to grow up in that hellhole. Who didn't deserve to be raised in a house where abuse was allowed to fester. Where silence was the only law. The escape wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. But it had to be done. And somehow I had to make it happen. I had spent the last few days planning. Every move, every detail. But it was harder than I had imagined. The house was small, the walls were thin, and my father was always home. He never left. The idea of sneaking out without him noticing seemed impossible. But I had no choice. I couldn't wait for a perfect moment. There would never be one. I knew I had to wait until my father and Tony were asleep. They always stayed up late, drinking and talking. But they were also heavy sleepers. If I was careful, if I was quiet enough, maybe, just maybe, I could slip away without them noticing. I stood in my room that night, holding Charles in my arms, staring at the small suitcase I had packed. It wasn't much, just the basics. Clothes for Charles, a few things for me, and a little bit of money I had managed to save over time. I couldn't take much. I couldn't afford to take much. I had no idea how I was going to survive once I left, but I knew that if I stayed, I would only be digging my own grave. The fear was overwhelming. I could feel my hands trembling as I zipped up the suitcase. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart skip a beat. I could hear my father's loud snoring from the other room, and I could hear Tony moving about in his bed. I had to move fast. I took one last look at the room. The bed was unmade, the walls were bare, and the air felt thick with the memories I had tried so hard to bury. I wasn't just leaving Oakage. I was leaving a part of myself behind. A part of me that had been destroyed by the very people who were supposed to love me. But I couldn't stay. Not anymore. I had to do this for Charles. I opened the window slowly, wincing as the old wooden frame groaned under the pressure. The moonlight spilled into the room, casting long shadows across the floor. The night was quiet, too quiet. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I climbed through the window, carefully balancing Charles in my arms as I stepped into the cool night air. The ground below was soft with grass, and I felt a brief wave of relief wash over me. But that relief was quickly replaced by the gnawing fear in my stomach. This was it. This was my chance. I had no idea where I was going, no plan for the future. But I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't let my son grow up in that house, in that family. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I looked back at the house, the place I had spent so many years hoping would change. The place that had shaped me into someone I didn't even recognize anymore. And then I turned away. I didn't look back. I began walking down the dark, narrow street, my footsteps quiet but purposeful. The only sound was the distant hum of the highway and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't even know where to start. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't let Charles live through another night of fear. I couldn't let him grow up thinking this was what family was supposed to be. I reached the edge of town where the streets grew emptier, where the lights of Oakage faded behind me. I didn't know how far I would have to walk, but I kept going. The weight of my suitcase felt heavier with every step, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had come too far. After what felt like hours, I reached the bus station. It was small and quiet, just a few dim lights flickering in the night. I walked up to the ticket counter, feeling a sense of unease settle in my stomach. I didn't have much money, just a few bills tucked in my pocket. But I knew I had to get away. I had to go somewhere far from Oakage. Somewhere where no one would know my name. Somewhere where I could start over. Where can I go with this? I asked, my voice shaky as I pulled out the crumpled bills. The woman behind the counter glanced at me, then at Charles in my arms. Where do you want to go? She asked, her voice soft, as if she could sense the desperation in my eyes. Anywhere, I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. Just get me as far away as possible. She nodded, and after a moment of silence, she handed me a ticket. The next bus is leaving for Nashville, she said. It'll get you out of here. I took the ticket, my fingers trembling as I held it tightly in my hand. Nashville. It wasn't the place I had planned to go, but it was somewhere. And somewhere was better than nowhere. I found a seat on the bus, holding Charles close to me. The bus was nearly empty. Just a few other passengers scattered throughout. As the engine roared to life, I leaned back in my seat, staring out the window at the passing lights. The streets of Oakage disappeared in the distance, and I felt something inside me shift. This was my chance. This was my escape. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I'd ever find a way out of the darkness that had followed me for so long. But in that moment, as the bus rumbled forward, I finally felt a glimmer of hope. A small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I could build a life for Charles and me. A life where we were free. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that I could make it. I could start over. I could protect my son. And I would never let anyone take that away from me again. The ride to Nashville was long and silent, save for the low hum of the bus engine and the occasional cry from Charles, who was still too young to fully understand what was happening. His innocent little face, flushed with sleep, rested against my shoulder, his tiny fingers curling around my sleeve as though holding on to whatever security he could find. As the bus sped through the night, I felt both a deep sense of loss and a faint stir of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: hope. I had spent my entire life in fear. Fear of my father's temper. Fear of Tony's manipulation. Fear of the unknown. But now, as the lights of Oakage receded into the distance, I felt something shift inside me. The town that had been my prison was fading away, and with it, the girl who had once thought that silence and submission were her only options. I was no longer Jessica Randall, the broken girl from Oakage. I was Eleanor Reeves now. The name was simple, but it felt like freedom in my mouth. Eleanor. It was a name I had chosen for myself, a name that held no history, no secrets. It was a name I could build a future with, one that wasn't tainted by my past. Reeves, well, that was just a name I liked. There was no deep meaning behind it, no family tie. It was a fresh start, a clean slate. In Nashville, I knew I would be anonymous. For the first time, I wouldn't have to look over my shoulder, wondering if someone from Oakage would see me, someone who knew the truth. I could blend in with the crowd, be just another person in the city, another face in the sea of strangers. The thought both comforted and terrified me. When the bus arrived in Nashville, I stepped off the pavement into the unfamiliar world I now had to navigate. The city was big, bustling with life, a far cry from the quiet, oppressive small town I had known. I had never been to a place like this. There were tall buildings, bright lights, and people everywhere. For the first time, I felt like I could be anyone. I didn't have much, just the bag I had packed in secret, the few clothes I had managed to bring, and Charles, who was starting to stir awake. My fingers brushed the ticket that had gotten me here, clutched tightly in my pocket. A bus ticket, a simple piece of paper that had taken me away from everything I had ever known. But I wasn't alone. Charles was with me, and that was all that mattered. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. I wandered the streets, unsure of where to go, where to stay. But I knew I couldn't stay on the streets for long. I needed a place for Charles to sleep, somewhere safe, away from the noise and the chaos of the city. By luck, or perhaps fate, an ad in the newspaper caught my eye. A boarding house in a quiet part of town, just a few blocks away from the bus station. It offered room and board in exchange for work, something I could afford to do. I had no money to my name, but I could clean, cook, and help out in exchange for a roof over my head. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I went to the address listed in the ad and knocked on the door. A woman in her 50s answered. Her name was Mrs. Ruth, and her soft eyes took me in with a mixture of curiosity and kindness. I introduced myself as Eleanor Reeves and explained my situation, how I had come to Nashville to start over, to escape the life I had left behind. I didn't tell her everything. I couldn't. But I gave her just enough of the truth. Enough for her to know that I was desperate for a place to stay, and that I was willing to do anything to keep my son safe. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "We can always use some extra help around here," she said, her voice warm. "Come on in. You and your son can stay with us for a while." The moment I stepped through the door, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. It wasn't a grand house, but it was clean, it was quiet, and most importantly, it was safe. It was more than I had ever hoped for in that moment. That first night, I put Charles to bed in a small room at the back of the house. He was still too young to understand what had happened, too young to know that his world was changing. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "It's just you and me now, kid. And I'll do everything I can to make sure you're happy, safe, and loved." As I lay in my own bed that night, the silence of the house surrounding me, I couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought me here. It felt like a lifetime ago when I had first made the decision to leave Oakage. I had no idea what the future held. No idea what was waiting for me in this strange new city. But for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that I could make it. That I could build something better for myself and Charles. In the days that followed, I started to settle into a routine. I helped Mrs. Ruth with the housework, cooking meals for the other residents, cleaning, and doing laundry. The work was hard, but it gave me a sense of purpose. It made me feel like I was contributing to something real. But the hardest part by far was facing the truth of what had happened. I hadn't had the chance to process everything, what Tony had done, what my father had allowed, and the consequences that still lingered. I was in a new city with a new name, but I couldn't escape the memories. They followed me, haunting me in my dreams, in my quiet moments when the world around me fell silent. There were days when I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. The shame, the guilt, the memories. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to remember the life I had left behind, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. And then there were moments when I would look at Charles, and I would see his bright, innocent eyes and feel the love that flowed between us. In those moments, I realized that I wasn't doing this just for myself. I was doing this for him. For my son, who had been born into a world of violence, but who had the chance to grow up in a world of love. I owed it to him to give him the life I had never had, the life I had been too afraid to dream about. One evening, as I was putting Charles to bed, I looked out the window at the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of possibility. There was hope in the air. There was the promise of a new beginning. In that moment, I made a vow to myself. I would never let the past define me. I would build a future for Charles, for us. A future where we were free to be who we were, without fear, without shame. I wasn't Jessica Randall anymore. I was Eleanor Reeves. And I was going to make it. It's a strange thing to look at your own child and see reflections of a person you wish to forget. Charles, my son, was the light of my life. He was everything I had ever hoped for: kind, bright, and full of laughter. But there were times when I would look at him, and for a split second I'd see something that took me back. It wasn't his smile or his eyes that reminded me of Tony. It was something else. A way he would hold his head, or a subtle way he would speak, that flickered briefly in the shadows of my memory. And it terrified me. Charles was growing up in a world so different from mine, and yet, his existence carried the weight of everything that had happened before him. I couldn't escape that truth, no matter how far I had run. He was, in part, my redemption, but he was also a reminder of everything I had tried to leave behind. He had my eyes, my hair, but more than anything, he had my soul. He was my hope, my future. And I would protect him from the world that had once shattered me. But the resemblance to Tony, the green eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same jawline, kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling. Every time Charles looked up at me with those eyes, I would remember Tony's cold stare, the one he used when he had control over me. I couldn't allow myself to believe that Tony's blood ran through my son's veins. It wasn't possible. No matter how much Charles resembled him, he was not Tony. He could never be Tony. I wouldn't let it happen. As the years went by, Charles grew stronger, more independent and more confident. He excelled in school, made friends easily, and showed promise in everything he did. I was so proud of him. He was everything I had dreamed of for him, everything I had wished I could have been. But I could never shake the fear that one day, something inside him would change, that his resemblance to Tony would become more than just physical, that he might grow into the same person who had abused me, who had destroyed everything I held dear. I wanted to believe it wasn't true, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Charles, at 15, was beginning to make decisions for himself. He had started high school and was getting more involved in sports, making new friends, and developing a stronger sense of who he was. He had begun to ask questions about his father, about the man he had never known. It was natural, of course. Every child eventually wants to know about their biological father, about their roots. But every time Charles asked, I was faced with the same dilemma. How could I explain what Tony had done to me without shattering the illusion of safety I had worked so hard to create for him? I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. Not yet. Not when he was still so young, still so innocent. I wanted to shield him from the ugly parts of my past, from the things I had buried so deeply inside me. But I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable forever. One day, Charles would want to know more, and I had to be prepared. It wasn't just the fear of Charles learning the truth that kept me up at night. It was the fear that I had passed on something far more dangerous than just genetics. I had raised him to be strong, to be kind, to stand up for what was right. But what if I had unknowingly passed down the same violent tendencies that Tony had? What if Charles had inherited Tony's dark side? The part of him that controlled, manipulated, and hurt others. The thought made my stomach churn, and I could feel the old panic rising in my chest. I tried to focus on the good, on the things that Charles had learned from me. He was loving and gentle, respectful of others, and fiercely protective of those he cared about. He had grown into a young man who was the polar opposite of Tony in every way. But the fear, the constant worry that one day he might turn into someone I didn't recognize, was always there, like a shadow lurking behind every step he took. The more Charles grew, the more I realized just how different he was from Tony. He was empathetic, a listener, a problem solver. He had a heart for people, a deep understanding of right and wrong. I couldn't deny that he was a reflection of the life I had always hoped for him. A life full of love, of freedom, of opportunity. But there were moments, quiet moments, when I would catch myself looking at him and seeing Tony, and that terrified me. One night, as Charles and I sat in the living room after dinner, he turned to me with an unusual seriousness in his eyes. He had just turned 16, and his questions had grown more pressing. "Mom, why don't I have a dad?" he asked, his voice soft yet insistent. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question sink deep into my chest. He had asked this before in passing, but this time felt different. This time he needed an answer. He deserved an answer. I looked at him, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to consume me. My first instinct was to protect him from the truth, to shield him from the darkness that lay buried in the past. But I knew I couldn't lie to him forever. The time would come when he would need to know. "Your father. He's not someone you should think about, Charles," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "He wasn't a good man. He didn't care about you or me, and that's the truth." Charles was quiet for a moment, taking in my words. His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read, but he didn't ask any more questions that night. Instead, he just nodded, and for the first time I saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. I didn't want him to carry the weight of my past, but I knew that one day, I would have to tell him the whole truth. I didn't want him to grow up with the same fear and shame I had carried with me for so long. But I also knew that some things, some truths would take time. And until then, I would protect him. I would do whatever it took to make sure he never felt the darkness that had clouded my childhood. As the years went on, Charles continued to thrive. He became a young man with dreams of his own, and I watched him with pride as he navigated the world with a strength that came from the love I had given him. He was different from Tony in every way, and the more I saw him grow, the more I realized that he was a testament to the love and care that had been missing from my own life. But the fear never fully left me. The fear that one day he would look at me and see something in me that I couldn't hide. The fear that one day he would see the same thing in himself. The fear that despite everything I had done to protect him, despite all the love I had given him, there was still a part of me that I couldn't protect him from. One day he would find out. And when he did, I could only hope that the love I had given him would be enough to shield him from the legacy of pain and violence that had haunted me for so long. But until then I would hold on to him. Hold on to my son, my hope and my future, and never let go. I'm 73 years old now, sitting on the porch of my little house in the quietest corner of this world I've built for myself. The world outside is different from the one I knew, but even here, in the solitude I've carved out, the memories still linger. They're not as loud as they used to be, not as painful, but they're there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when I can't hold them back any longer. I never thought I would share this story, not with anyone. I spent most of my life trying to bury it, trying to erase the parts of me that I hated, the parts that belonged to a time and place where silence was the only defense. But now, as I sit here looking out at the world that's changed so much since my youth, I know I can't keep it locked away any longer. For years, I believed that sharing my story would only bring more pain. I convinced myself that I was better off keeping everything to myself, pretending that I was just like everyone else, that nothing had ever happened to me. But the truth is, there are too many women, too many children, out there who are living through the same thing. And if I keep quiet now, if I allow this part of me to remain hidden, then I am no better than the people who made me feel ashamed to speak in the first place. My name is Eleanor Reeves. When I was born in 1951, I was named Jessica Randall, and I spent most of my childhood in the small town of Oakage, Alabama, where everything I knew and loved was wrapped in a veil of secrecy and fear. I grew up thinking that my family was everything. I thought that the love we shared could withstand anything. But I was wrong. The first time I felt something was terribly wrong in my family, I was 7 years old. I overheard my father shouting at my mother, like so many other nights, but this time the words were different. This time it wasn't just a fight. It was about control. It was about power. It was about me. My father wasn't shouting because I had misbehaved or made a mistake. He was shouting because he couldn't stand that I was there, taking up space in his world. "You're not a son. You're just a burden," he would say to me, his words cutting deep, even though I was too young to fully understand their meaning. And that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it came later, when I realized that my brother Tony, the one person I had trusted, the one person I thought was there to protect me, was the one who was hurting me. He was the one who was breaking me. He wasn't just an older brother. He was the monster in my house. And my father, he couldn't see it. He couldn't even imagine it. To him, Tony was perfect and I was just the girl who didn't matter. I kept the secret. I kept it because I had no choice. If I told anyone, they wouldn't believe me. My father would never believe me. And my mother? She was too afraid to do anything. She saw the signs, but she couldn't find the strength to stand up to my father. And so I suffered in silence. For years, I tried to protect my family from the truth. I tried to keep it buried deep down inside of me, where it couldn't hurt anyone else. But it hurt me. It hurt me every single day. And when I found out I was pregnant by my own brother, when I realized that my life had been stolen from me in ways I couldn't even understand, I knew I had to leave. I knew I had to get away from Oakage. But I didn't know how. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have anything. I remember walking down those dusty streets, clutching Charles in my arms, and praying that somehow, someway I would make it out. That the world would be different, that I could start over. I couldn't bring myself to believe that I could survive this. But something inside of me knew that if I didn't try, I would die under the weight of everything that had happened. So I ran. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. I spent years wandering from place to place, finding temporary homes, working odd jobs, trying to make ends meet. But every step I took away from Oakage was a step toward healing. Every small victory, every moment I survived, was a triumph over the past. I eventually found my way to a boarding house in Nashville, and that's where my life began to change. I found work. I found a community of women who didn't judge me, who didn't look down on me, and who helped me build a life for Charles. They were women who whispered, not screamed, who offered support instead of silence. And for the first time I realized that I wasn't alone. It took years for me to understand that the abuse I had suffered didn't define me, that the things I had been through didn't have to control my life forever. But it wasn't until Charles grew older that I truly understood what I had done. I had made it. I had survived, not just for myself but for him. I had given him a future that was free of the past. I raised him to be strong. I raised him to be kind. I raised him to understand that love was not something you took from someone. Love was something you gave. And I believed with all my heart that he would grow up to be a man who was nothing like his father, nothing like Tony. He would be his own person, someone who would never make the same mistakes, someone who would never allow the darkness of the past to taint his future. But there were moments, even as Charles grew older, when the fear would return. The fear that I had passed something on to him, that there was something in his blood, something in his eyes, that would one day come to light. But I didn't let it consume me. I couldn't, because I had to believe that everything I had done for him, everything I had fought for, had been worth it. When Charles asked about his father, I told him what I could. I told him that I loved him, and that I had always loved him even before he was born. I told him that the past was behind us, and that we would never go back to it. He didn't need to know the details. He didn't need to know the horror that had shaped me, because he had his own life to live, his own future. And now here I am, at 73 years old, telling this story for the first time. I'm not telling it for sympathy. I'm not telling it for recognition. I'm telling it because there are so many women out there who are living through the same hell I lived through. And I want them to know that they are not alone. I want them to know that there is hope, that there is a way out, that you can survive. This story isn't just mine. It's the story of every woman who has ever been silenced, who has ever been made to feel less than, who has ever been forced to keep the pain inside. And it's for every woman who one day will find the strength to speak out. If you're watching this, I want you to know that you are not alone. You are stronger than you think. And no matter how dark the road may seem, there is always a way out. And as for me, I'm no longer Jessica Randall.
I'm Eleanor Reeves.
A mother, a survivor. A woman who has reclaimed her life and her voice. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving me the chance to share my story. And if you're going through something similar, I encourage you to reach out. There is help. There is always help. And you can make it. You will make it.